And we are live. Hey guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. How is everyone doing? Remember, this is a place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain what is most factual and logically consistent. In today's show, we are going to be talking about the state of the Black family. And I have here with me Professor Robert Sherry, who has been um, a frequent guest to this show. This is not his first time of being with us in this show, sharing his insights. And we're going to be talking about his latest book, The State of the Black Family. Professor Robert Sherry is a professor emeritus at Brooklyn University with a PhD in economics from Kansas State University. He's an author of many books, and his most recent book, The State of the Black Family, forms the topic of our conversation today. So I'd like you guys to just join us in this conversation, in this ride, as we have this fruitful conversation today. So, Professor Robert Sherry, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. How are you
Well,
doing? How have
thanks
you been
for
since the
having me
last time
on,
we spoke?
Charles. Thanks a great deal.
Yeah. So, when your book came out, you sent me an excerpt. You sent me an excerpt of it and the book cover, and I had the good fortune of going through it, and I've been able to pass out some questions from it, which we are going to need you to shed some more lights on it today in this stream, right? So you had a conversation with Glenn Lowry about a week or two ago. I watched that conversation. I noticed at a point you said the title of the book, this wasn't the initial title of the book. The State of the Black Family wasn't your initial title. You had thought of something else, but somehow your editors overrode you. So, do you want to share with us what title you had initially wanted to use for this book?
Well, the title I wanted was something like the subtitle, which is Tragedies 60 Years of Tragedies and Failures and, and New Initiatives Offering Hope. The reason I was skeptical of having the main title, The Black Family, is it's a hot button issue. And while I have a couple of chapters in the book, two chapters for sure, and in other chapters I have material as well on the Black family, the book is a lot more than that. It's about these initiatives. And I didn't want people who aren't comfortable with discussing the Black family because it's historically been a way in which conservatives have dismissed a lot of the real problems the Black community faces by saying, if you just get married and have traditional families, everything would be solved. So I didn't want to even suggest that kind of an attitude. Uh, but my publisher uh, had the last say. And so here we are.
Yeah. So interesting story. So what was your motivation? Was the basic motivation behind you wanting to write this book?
Well, as I discussed in the first chapter, in one way or another, I have been researching and been politically active around issues of race for 50 years. I'm a child of the 60s. I was in college at that point, and there was this civil rights movement that energized me. And as a child of working class Jewish parents, very much like Bernie Sanders, he in fact graduated my high school 1 year before me. That there was a certain kind of family history of experiencing bigotry, discrimination, uh, that made me become uh, committed professionally to doing what I could in trying to rectify the situation. Uh, I started out as a revolutionary communist in the 60s and 70s. Uh, and um, but I was always committed to policies, and that's been my writings for these many decades. And it became pretty obvious, particularly after the experience of Barack Obama, that things were not going to be moving in the right direction.
mm,
And you had added this gun violence in black communities. You had other things that were making these issues paramount to deal with in a constructive way. And hopefully, if people listen to this interview, hopefully get my book, they see how there are constructive things that can be done to move the black urban areas and the people who live in them forward.
mm. Yeah. So I see this there's this thread. I think Thomas Sowell also said something like that. That I see that there were a lot of intellectuals who were somewhat drawn to communism at a certain point in their early careers, right? And somehow along the line. So what is it about communism or socialism that's so appealing to young minds, to intellectuals at first, before you get the wake-up call?
Well, it's, my grandparents worked as unskilled workers in the garment center in New York. And when you grow up with a class perspective that there are working people and there are people who are screwing working people, it's very easy to want to fundamentally transform that system. And notions of communism uh, are very appealing, particularly when you don't see the practices of communist countries. Uh, so, as people said, if you weren't a communist in your 20s, you had no heart. If you were still a communist in your 40s, you had no head. So, that's somewhat my dynamics.
Mm. And going back to Thomas Sowell, he said something about that the vision of the left is infinitely better than the vision of the right in terms of where we want to get to, right? But it's just that the
That's right.
realities of life is sort of different. How do you intend to achieve those things? Some of those things are impracticable. Some of them might be too idealistic to have in practice. So I can understand how people are drawn to communism or socialism because of the promises that it makes, right? Which is part of the problem I have at times with the right. The right, they have a difficulty formulating a positive message. It's almost as if they're always reactionary to the left. They're always wanting to counter. Where is your positive message that people can look to and say, okay, there is something to look to? Um,
Well, let me. So you have some young kids in the house, huh?
yeah, my daughter.
So, I'm caught in between. So there are people like, um, there are some conservatives who are unwilling to accept the fact that any government policy can be effective, no matter how well intentioned. Once it gets in the hands of government bureaucrats, it becomes a loser. And there's a lot of truth in that. That's why the subtitle has 60 years of tragedies and failures. But you just can't rely on people's individual initiative. Certainly, where the left is appallingly bad is they take away agency from the underclass, from poorer people. They say the system is stacked against you. You can't do anything to get ahead. You're in the, it's a fool's journey to try to use your individual initiative to succeed. Uh, and I think on the one hand, individual initiative is central to people moving ahead, but it's not the only thing. And that's why you need government programs that can be effective. That's why you need certain kind of laws that uh, take away some of the roadblocks that individuals face. So it's a kind of middle position which doesn't get you much energy. Where on the one hand you have these aspirational goals and commitments that people have a lot of energy behind on the left, and on the other hand you got these conservatives who say only thing is individual initiative, only thing is people have to get married, that individuals have to solve their problems themselves. And I think both sides uh, are lead people down the wrong paths.
Interesting. So, talking about the state of the black family, what are the defining features of the black family today? What are those elements that defines the black family today?
See, this is why I didn't want that title. I don't want to always talk about it, but I think what's defining the black family today is that on the one hand, black women, even if they're not married, black women have really been able to move ahead since welfare reform 25 years ago. If you look at their occupational attainment, you look at their educational attainment, they're success stories to a very, very large degree. On the other hand, for black men, it's more than uneven. You have too many black men that have fallen by the wayside. And that's one of the reasons it's very hard to simply promote marriage. These women need to have men who are much more responsible and much more successful than many of these black men are. So that's one of the dynamics of the black family, is this very unevenness between black women and black men in the United States. Uh, and it's complicated why these black men are in that situation and what can be done about it. And I have a good deal in the book that tries to realistically look at what kind of dynamics can can turn that around to a reasonable degree.
Okay, so the subtitle of your book some relates to somehow to 60 years of failed governmental policies, right? So prior to the 1960s, prior to the Civil Rights Act and all that, what was the state of the black family prior to then? Was it any better than it is
The black
currently?
family in the 1950s through early 60s, the marriage rate in the black family was exactly the same as the white marriage rate. This idea that the lack of marriage is a legacy of slavery is just bullshit. That blacks were poor in the 50s and early 60s, but they were married. They had intact families. And yes, the number of children born out of wedlock to unmarried women was modestly higher among blacks. But that did not mushroom until the 70s and the 80s, where it goes from 25 to, by the time you get to the early 90s, it's pushing on 70%. So, there was, and the story of why that changed is complicated, I, but this idea that it's simply a legacy of slavery, it's because of long sustained poverty, just doesn't hold up when you look at marriage rates in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s among blacks.
Mm. So there is something that I usually try to guard against, which is the danger of single cause narratives, right? Because it's
Hmm.
easy for one to go down the path of saying um, single motherhood is the cause of all the problems in the black community, just as much as it's easy to say it's systemic racism or white supremacy, right? So
Exactly.
I have a question for you. Taken from a quote from your book, black neighborhoods are plagued with, the problems of crime, poverty, violence, poor academic performance in comparison to other racial groups. Now, in your book, it is stated that while the roots of these problems are multiple, one source has been the black family, just as you've said. But can you tell me what other factors aside the black family contributes to these problems and possibly rank them in order of importance?
I'll give 65% to the black. No, uh, I think that there is certainly racism that has impeded progress. And I think even though the last 30 years have been, there's been a change, you know, young people today have parents, have grandparents that experienced significant, if not severe, discrimination. And that is going to have an overlay on young people so that they are not going to be as self confident or foolish in many ways that young white people can be, that, the world is out there for them and so on. So I think the past history of racial discrimination gives a certain kind of overlay. I think that the violence in black neighborhoods, this gun violence, has a devastating effect not only on because people are killed, 10,000 a year of black homicides, mostly in urban areas, mostly by black perpetrators. But if you're a kid growing up in those neighborhoods and you hear gunshots, you're going to be impacted in ways. You're going to be traumatized, or not so infrequently, by uh, this environment. If you're a young black man, boy, 10, 11, 13, 14, you're going to have to feel it. You got to be tough in these neighborhoods, because if you're not tough, you're going to get pushed around by other people. And what does this toughness mean? You're going to get into fights, and you're going to have behavioral problems that will end up with schooling issues. So I think now, why is there gun violence in black neighborhoods more than other neighborhoods? Uh, that's a complicated situation, but I think the gun violence has a broader sweep on impacting on people, on young black kids, on black adolescents, that holds them back. But I also think the victimization ideology has has harmful effects on many blacks, because if you from day one in the schools, on the media, are being told this is a white supremacist society, there's structural racism, that you're never going to get ahead on your own merit, what do you think that's going to do to a young kid if they hit some roadblock in school or in work or anywhere? If they hit a little roadblock, it's real easy for them to say, that's what they say, this is a racist society, and they give up in many ways. So I think this victimization rhetoric is an important source of why blacks do not strive as much as we might expect them to.
Okay, so I'd like to push back a little bit on this last point you just made, right? Because I think there's a difference between political rhetoric and what really happens within the family itself, or when people um, I doubt if there are if in black families the fathers and the mothers and the uncles and the aunts and the grandparents are telling the kids that you can't get ahead in life because of racism. I doubt if that's the message. I can understand them posturing for the public. I can understand politicians posturing for the public by saying it's all systemic racism. But within the confines of the home, within the churches, within the black communities themselves, is that really the compelling message that is being passed out? Are we not
Well,
confusing political rhetoric for
part of the problem is there is not the kind of black community that was 30, 40, 50 years ago. Sure, there's a black church, but it is not as powerful as it was. Extended families, aunts, uncles, and so on. It's not there to the extent. We're a much more atomized world where people are there on their own. That's why there's a lot of loneliness in contemporary society. Is we don't have the kind of social fabric that we did in the past. And the fact is that you can have aunts and uncles who are going to be saying, I didn't get that promotion. I didn't get that job. I didn't do well on that test because racism. You have, this whole attack on standardized tests as being racist, as being ways to hold black America is pretty widely held among liberals and I think in the black community that whether it's taking the exam to be a social worker, taking the exam to be a school teacher, blacks don't do as well as white or Asian test takers. And so there were lots of easy excuses for not being able to perform well. So I'm pushing back on you uh, that I'm I wouldn't underestimate it. This this impact of an environment in which it is taken for granted there's deep structural racism in the U.S. and a kind of white supremacist environment uh, that's going to impact on young people.
okay? So, on to my next question. Talking about the 60 years of failed government policies, right? Welfare and affirmative action and so many other policies. I don't think that these policies were specifically targeted to black families, right?
Well,
So,
somewhat. Let me give the example. Head Start.
okay,
There and now what's called universal pre-kindergarten. There was an extensive approach that said we can circumvent the family. We can give three, not 3 year old, but 4 and 5 year olds the kind of skills and behaviors that will allow them to succeed in the school system without dealing with the family. So first it was Head Start programs, and now it's what's called universal pre-kindergarten. These, by and large, there's been lots of testing of the results. They have, at best, transitory impacts on educational outcomes. What I point out in the book, there are ways to get into the family to give support to that single mother. There's something called a visiting nursing program where pregnant young women, unmarried, they get assigned a visiting nurse who helps them through the last half of their pregnancy and the first 2 to 3 years of their kids, until the kids are 2 or 3. These visiting nurses not only help giving the mothering skills that many of these women have no models of. They didn't particularly come from the best families situations. And it also helps them in the kind of life choices they have to make about their own lives. So, this is an approach when the kids are 4 and 5 year old. There's parents as teachers, a program that comes into the family. And then in the best charter schools, the charter schools have strategies to involve the mothers in their children's educational development. So, uh, so that's my approach. Yes, it'd be great if there were two-parent families, and there are ways we might encourage that in adolescence. But the reality is, we have to help these young mothers navigate both for themselves and for their kids if we want to change the patterns that have existed for these last 30, 40, 50 years.
So I guess my question is these policies, right? Why was there a disproportionate impact, negative impact of these policies on Black families, on the Black community? If the policies did not say specifically this is meant for Black people,
Yeah,
let's
but
talk about.
don't forget up till about 10 or 15 years ago, the issue of single mothers was overwhelmingly a black and maybe Latino issue, but it wasn't a white issue. In the last 15, 20 years, it's become more of a white issue, not as much as black, but, so these kinds of Head Start programs, these pre-K, universal pre-K programs were really meant to respond to what was not necessarily unique, but a distinctive feature of the black family, single headedness.
Okay, so when Moynihan brought out his reports, the out of wedlock birth rate was around 25% for the Black family, right? Now it's
Um,
around
25% of children born were to unmarried
yes,
mothers.
yes, 25%. And he said it was a problem then. And now it's around 70%, which I think is a problem. Now, the white community, right? Today, the single motherhood in the white community, isn't it more than 25%?
Oh, yes, for a long time it was like well less than 10%. But in the last decade, decade and a half, it has grown, and it might be over 30% now, for sure.
So are we
So
seeing the similar patterns, similar pathologies, similar challenges with white single mothers as we and their children as we see with black single mothers and the children?
we're seeing that with men, with boys, that the single-headedness, for a variety of reasons, which are somewhat distinct in the black community, but for a variety of reasons, this single-headedness uh, impacts much more on males. I mean, I talked about this uh, requirement that many young black men feel they have to be tough because if they don't, they'll be pushed around, etc. Young girls go through, they have issues, but particularly when they're thir- 13, 14, and 15. But they don't have these kind of issues when they're 8, 9, 10, and 11 that the boys have. And also, you don't have the same kind of gun violence and fighting in white working class communities. So you may have a young white boy, coming from a single headed household, but doesn't quite have the same hurdles that the young black boy has to navigate.
So there's a theory that a lot of the problems you find in the black community, say drugs, most especially drugs, that the government had a big hand in that, in pushing drugs into these communities, to destroy these communities, so that they can criminalize them and lock young black men up. What do you think about that theory that these pathologies were
Well,
actually
look,
started by the government?
well, this was a theory that had credibility in the 70s and even somewhat in the 80s. But we're 40 years from that. And it isn't as if the white community with opiates has been immune. In fact, almost all of the opiate deaths, the vast majority, are white. Uh, so the issue of drugs is around, and how the government deals with it is kind of complicated. It ends up that for the last 20 years, you don't go to jail simply on drug charges. In New York City, 80% of the people who are being held in Rikers Island on bail, 80% are there for violent felonies. If you look who's in the prisons now, it's people for violent felonies. The majority, the vast majority are there. So, there are stories. Michelle Alexander had a book, The New Jim Crow, that came out 15 years ago, that kind of built a case around this. It's just not true anymore.
Okay. So I think I guess my question is still trying to understand if black communities and white communities are faced with similar challenges. It seems as if there is a different response to um, to this both these communities to those challenges. So I really want to understand what makes the difference if the the white single motherhood problem is also rising and close to what the black was when Moynihan did his
Well,
report.
one of the things that you have much more in the black, first of all, it's much larger in the black community. It's still 30 versus 70%. So it's
Yep,
not the same. Secondly,
true.
you have much more in the black community than the white community, what's called multi partner fertility. That is, a woman hooks up with a guy, has a kid, they break up, she hooks up with the next guy, has a kid with the next guy. There's That's a very substantial part of the dynamics in the black community, not as much in the white community. And having these multi families where you can have the second guy, he's the father to one of the kids, but what about the other kid or kids that his partner brings along from her first relationship? Those kids, particularly the males from that first relationship, they so often get lost. They don't have, this guy might be an okay guy, but he's going to focus on his biological kid. And the mother, she may be much more focused on the daughter from the previous relationship, and her son gets lost. And so there are dynamics that are still much more distinctive to the black family, that and it's the case also that there's more low income in the black community. So when I grew up, I might have been poor, and we were poor, but I had a well-to-do uncle. That's much more prevalent in the white community. So these white single mothers who have kids, they may come from a modestly successful family where their parents can give support, where they got aunts and uncles who are moderately successful. That's much more likely in the white community than in these poor black communities in the inner city, where, you know, the what it meant to be successful is somebody became got a union, got a government job as a transit worker, kind of. That's maybe the most successful extended family that this black unwed mother has. So I think there are degrees that when you add them up, each one of these little things, they put many more black single mothers and their kids in risky situations. And, that's why these visiting nursing programs, these parents as teacher programs, these charter schools are extremely important to get those kids and their mother on the road to modest success.
Mm. So it sounds like what you're saying is that wealth does matter. Money does matter in shaping the outcomes of these kids, right? So
Yes.
it's not just about not having a father in a home, having some sort of support structure from an extended family, from a moderate, well-to-do family, somehow has an impact in how the kid turns out.
It certainly makes a difference between the life chances of a black child from an unwed mother and a white child from an unwed mother. It does make a difference.
Okay. So my follow-up question would be, let's talk about the impact of outsourcing of US manufacturing to low-wage countries and the disproportionate effect it had on the black men. So from your book, you said that by 1990, only 12% of black men were employed in manufacturing compared to 40% 15 years earlier. By
Right, in the
contrast,
Midwest,
whites,
in the Midwest,
yes,
which is the core manufacturing area in the U.S.,
yes. So
was it was it
so
was this
my
outsourcing.
question, yeah, I'm not done with my question though.
Okay,
So, so by contrast, it said white employment fell by only 10 percent points. So
that's
I'm
right.
asking, why did
Manufacturing
this
employment.
outsourcing, yeah, why did this outsourcing affect black men much more disproportionately than white men?
Well, this is the 1980s, and there was still a strong stereotype that black men don't have the right work ethics. They not only don't work as hard, but they talk back. They don't put up with stuff they don't like. So they have attitude problems as well. It was one of the reason that Latinos replaced them. So it wasn't as if it was that whites kept all the jobs, but what moved into manufacturing was Latino workers. And there's, all kinds of studies that showed that employers were very straightforward. They would rather hire Latinos. And Latinos had a much stronger network. So if many of these jobs were situations in which the employer, he wouldn't advertise to get new workers publicly. He would tell his existing workers, "Do you know somebody who I should hire?" And that's very effective because a worker is not going to give a recommendation to someone who's not going to do well. So, using these informal markets, employers would rely on their existing workers, and Latinos had much more of an effective network to get more Latinos into jobs. So, that's what went on in the 80s and 90s. What you have now, I did a paper about uh, Philadelphia. Philadelphia has one of the highest poverty rates of any major city. You don't hear much about it because it has famous hospitals, famous universities. It has what's called a med ed expansion. It expands through its medical school infrastructure and its colleges. And, but there aren't jobs for less skilled black men. They're not the nurses. They're not uh, they're not the kind of labor or the support staff that women get jobs, middle lower level. And so I wrote about how these universities who are so concerned about equity, they should be much more proactive in going into the high schools and getting some of these young men to begin training to get IT kind of jobs, jobs that x ray technician jobs, jobs that can pay. And in fact, in my book, I say one of the most offensive things about liberals is there's this pushing of 4 year college for all. Because what a lot of young black men need, unfortunately, they get to high school with very limited academic schools, sometimes even behavioral problems. They need occupational training. They need what I described, I think the University of Pennsylvania should do in the high schools, begin to get people certified in occupational areas. And I have 2 chapters in the book that talk about this direction. It'd be great if all black youth become legitimate college material. But, if you look and I have lots of the data, there, the vast majority of 11th and 12th grade black kids are not prepared for academic work. They're just not, and it's unfortunate, and maybe changing the school system that I describe in the book. Certainly, charter schools can be effective, but we have to take people where they are and move them forward. And these occupational programs, there's something called stackable certificates, where you get one, gets you an entry level job. You take the second certificate, you move up, a third, and so on. They've been effective in South Carolina, in Louisiana, in the South, not in liberal bastions. Liberal bastions say, we don't want that. We want 4 year college for all. So they shove kids into the community colleges where they fail out. And you got lots of 20-year-olds who have no educational credential, no job, and they're on the street, and there's nothing good that's going to happen.
Mm. So, by the way, guys, you can get Professor Sherry's book. There is a link to the book in my description. In the description of this video, you can get his book from there. So, my follow-up question would be talking about going back to the disproportionate impact of manufacturing leaving the US on
Right.
black males, right? So those stereotypes of black males not being having the requisite skills, those stereotypes of them talking back, not being compliant, were those stereotypes, were they correct, or were they just racist tropes meant to keep black men out of employment?
Listen, to the extent they were used, they were racist tropes. Yeah. But, the reality is, and you can understand it, a Latino immigrant is going to be much more accepting of a lot of shit than a black. Now, what blacks might have been talking back to was quite appropriate. Speed up on the job, you can't take a bathroom break. There are lots of things, but you can understand that a Latino immigrant is not gonna is not gonna is gonna be much more compliant to those kind of things. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling kind of dynamics. And but again, that's 20, 30 years ago, and it it has little to do. I don't think there are those kinds of stereotypes today, particularly if there's a strong labor market. For black teenage boys, 16 to 19-year-old, employment has grown dramatically in the last decade. And during the pandemic, it's now is it's at historic levels. So, there certainly are those stereotypes. Uh, so, for example, there's evidence that black kids don't study as much. You look at average study time per day, black students, and these are middle school, high school, they study about half the time of whites and about a quarter of the time of Asian kids. Now, why are they doing that? it can fit into this kind of a stereotype of them being lazy. But I think part of it is this victimization theory. I really do believe that blacks have an attitude, young blacks, that things are stacked against them. So why should I, try to get a C plus or a B in my algebra in the ninth or 10th grade? Let me just get a D. I'll get through school because it's not going to make any difference to me. Uh, so I think that today, where you see things that could seem like it verifies a certain lack of black initiative, it's much more this this ideology that leads them to give up much more. Uh, when I did a book on welfare reform where I interviewed welfare mothers who uh, who were successful, and a large number of them talked about the men. And they said these men, they give up. They go in one job interview and they get turned down. They may go to a second and they say, "Yeah, this is a racist. These employers are racist. Why am I wasting my time?" And it's true they may be using it as an excuse, but I think to some degree they believe it. That so this issue of agency, being in control of your own life, uh, is extremely important to drill into young kids. The last point about this, I have a good friend, Ian Rowe, who runs a series of charter schools in the Bronx, New York City. And he just came out with a book, Agency. I would say it's a book people should get. Not before my book, but they should get this book, Agency, where he talks about that's what he wants to instill. These are charter schools that are overwhelmingly black and Latino. That's what his schools instill in his kids is the issue of agency, that you can control you. That doesn't mean you're going to be president of the United States or president of General Motors, but you can control your life and be successful if you do.
Mm. Okay, so before I ask my next question, when you were responding to this, two things came to my mind, especially as regards to black men not being compliant. So I'm forced to ask, right? If the black men were protesting unfair work conditions, where you can't take a break, you can't do certain things, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that a good thing to be calling for better work conditions? Why should they be punished for demanding something that any human being is? So it
That's
seems as
why I
if
started. That's why I started my adulthood as a communist. You know, you know, it's a situation in which employers want to make money, and if they have a workforce, there was a whole expose of the child labor that's being used in factories. These immigrant children who are coming across at 14, 13, 14, and 15, they have to pay back the coyotes. The coyotes get them to these factories in God knows where, and they're working, you know, 40, 60-hour work weeks in these factories. Where's Charles Dickens? This is the reality of the dark side of capitalism is you have people who, if they got a population they can take advantage of, they're going to do it.
mm. So in essence, black men were victims of the exploitation of capitalism.
Certainly some were. Now, I'm not saying in all cases it was the situation, but I'm saying that it it certainly was part of the equation.
Okay. So my next question would be, in your book, you wrote, yes, we must confront the vestiges of structural racism in American society and a harmful role that negative racial stereotypes still play. And the state of the Black family identifies corrective policies. So I want to ask, what are some of those structural racism that you speak about? And what is structural racism, first of all? And can you name some of the vestiges of structural racism today?
Well, I think one of the vestiges, I think an important one, is credentialization, is that the United States has created a job market where people have to have certain credentials that have nothing to do with the job. College degrees. Why do you need a 4 year degree for half of the jobs that people have? Why do you need 4 years experience or 3 years experience for certain jobs? Why do you need a certain certificate to to cut hair? Uh, why do we restrict what people who have a criminal record can do to the extent we do? There, I would say that that's currently one of the sets of barriers that black workers face, is that they don't have the kinds of credentials that are used to screen out applicants. And there are attempts to get rid of some of the requirements for certain occupations, uh, get rid of the college degree as a requirement for jobs. Now, was this set up to exclude blacks? I don't think it wasn't initially set up, but I think it's perpetuation over the last 20, 30 years. Its perpetuation has been, to some degree, a recognition that we can keep blacks out. Uh, the exam for promotion for firefighters, I have in the book. It's an unreasonable exam. It has nothing to do with experience, but it was something that white test takers did well at, and blacks didn't, and they kept it. So I think now you might say that that's true about the SATs and a certain range of required tests to get certification. And there may be some truth in that. But I think it there's certainly lots of uncontroversial examples of where credentials have been used to screen out uh, disproportionately black applicants.
All right. Um, so my next question would be, one of the principal insights in your book is that we're telling the wrong story about persisting racial disparity. So can you highlight how this is happening and what story we should be telling instead?
Well, as I've mentioned, the problem with the persistence is it leads to this kind of victimization narrative. Um, and as I point out in the book, when you look at where people talk about systemic racism, they do two things. One is they present examples from 30, 40, 50 years ago where there was no question, there were explicit barriers. There were covenants, you couldn't buy homes in certain neighborhoods. There were exclusions where blacks couldn't join certain unions. They were explicit, and there certainly was Jim Crow. So there are those things. And when you listen to people talk about systemic racism, they pile on those things and they give you some vague example currently, but it's mostly this history. And the second thing they do is they take it for granted that if there are racial disparities, it must be because of racism. That Exam scores are clearly one of the examples where if blacks don't do as well, the exams must be racist. Uh, and what I was raising with the firefighters was not that the exam was racist, but it was irrelevant. There's a difference between exams that are relevant and blacks do more poorly on, from exams that are not relevant, and therefore using them is simply to screen out blacks. That's an important difference. But getting back, when you parse what people write, it's really they now take for granted that if you can show wide racial disparity, like in police killings in the United States, wide racial disparity. Every study that's tried to look at that systematically, where you take into account who are the perpetrators of the crimes, finds that there's no racial disparity. But if you look at the absolute numbers, blacks who are killed by police, it's two or three times the rate that whites are. Now, if you look at who commits homicides, blacks are five times more likely to commit homicides than whites. So, so what I'm saying is that there are lots of disparities, racial. In schools, suspension rates of black kids are three times white rates. Almost immediately, the focus is on there's racist enforcement, that somehow these inequalities can't be legitimate in any way, and they're very sketchy about how they demonstrate that it's racist. Um, so, so I think that that is, you know, a problem. Is one, this overuse of old examples from 30, 40, 50, 70 years ago, and an unwillingness to look at why there are racial disparities on a whole range of measures.
Okay, so for me, I can parse this into two parts, right? I can say whatever disparities you are seeing today is not as a result of current racism. It's not as a result of current discrimination.
Not primarily, not it's
Not
still there
not
are there, but not primarily.
not primarily. Okay. But isn't it possible that some of these disparities are a carryover from what happened in the past? I mean, 30, 40 years ago is not such a long time. 60 years ago is not such a long time. Isn't it possible that these things that we see today, even though they are not, currently persisting, but they are a carryover of whatever structural policies or attitudes existed in the very near past?
Well, I gave the example of the life chances of a white child born to a single mother compared to a black child, that their life chances are not the same. And it has to do with past discrimination that allowed white families to be a little bit more prosperous than black families, uh, to be able to be more intact, maybe. So that's, that's a vestige of past discrimination to some degree. And there are other kinds of examples. The infrastructure of neighborhoods that Black Americans live in is often much poorer, much older than whites. And that's a vestige of the kind of past neglect of state and local governments in dealing with certain neighborhood issues. So, yes, there are modest vestiges of the past, and they certainly should be rectified, or if possible. But I think it's not the major. Um, set of reasons.
All right. I think we're nearing the end of the stream. So if anyone has any questions for Professor Sherry, I would entertain one question from anyone who wants to call in. Call in, you ask a question, and I will remove you. So Wislaw is here. He has a question for Professor Robert Sherry. When he asks, he will leave, and anyone else that wants to ask. So go ahead, Wislaw.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Yeah,
you.
we can hear you.
So, I had a question to one of your earlier points you were talking about. So, would this occupational therapy include actual like trade work? Because I remember when I myself had to go through the American mental health system, I learned that the male brain responds, it has a better emotional memory logging when it is completing tasks rather than traditional or widely accepted modes of therapy. So I would ask, wouldn't just doing these trades alone provide some sort of therapeutic help for these younger teenagers in these situations rather than trying to do the traditional method of therapy, since the male brain does actually respond to goal orientation or completion better than traditional therapy?
I, I, I agree with you in that many of these, I mentioned Louisiana, I mentioned South Carolina, many of these areas that have been much more active in developing occupational skills are hands on. They have relationship with the industries in which they're training people. They're not quite apprenticeship programs, but they have experiences that allow these young kids to have hands on experience rather than sitting in a classroom and listening to a video.
Ah, thank you. I'm glad. I'm glad that we see eye on that. Thank you
All
very
right.
much,
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you,
Yep.
Wislaw. So if there's anyone else who has a question for Professor Sherry, you want to call in, the link is in the chat. Just call in, ask your one question, and we'll soon bring this stream to an end. So, Professor Sherry, you talked about, I was going to ask you, how was your proposal, such as, I think you've answered this on occupational training, but you said something about planned gentrification as a way of solving some of these issues. How
Oh,
would that work?
well, the reality is that if you look at these poor central city neighborhoods that blacks, not all blacks, but a certain amount of blacks live in, the only time that those neighborhoods have been transformed has been through planned gentrification. That is bringing new housing into those neighborhoods because you have to bring back a middle class. Now, first, you have to get crime under control, and you have to have charter schools so that parents can feel comfortable with sending their kids to the neighborhood school. But there have been a significant number of poorer black communities throughout the United States that have been transformed through these planned gentrification policies.
All right. So, Professor Robert Sherry, thank you very much for your time. My last question would be, in summary, what would be your advice to young black men out there? Because they seem to be at the receiving end of um, whatever the issues are, the negative issues are. What would be your advice to them
Well,
as a summary before we leave?
the black men that I'm unfortunately focusing on are the ones who have fallen behind. So these are not people who, you can have the highest expectations. They're going to be doctors and lawyers, etc. My my point is that many of them should not be hustled into 4-year colleges where they don't have the skills. Uh, I have a lot in the book about what happens to these less than skilled people. It's that they should be find a kind of occupational program, find a nonprofit organization that can help them. And one of the things about these occupational programs that get you certification is you get around these issues of job credentials because you have a credential. You got the certificate. So again, this is a particular population that I'm talking about who are flailing around as 17 and 18-year-olds, 16-year-olds, flailing around. That's the group that should get the most guidance to get on the right path.
Thank you very much, Professor Robert Sherry. And on that note, we have come to the end of this conversation. Guys, I want you to please go over to Amazon in the link in the description of this video and get a copy of Professor Robert Sherry's book. I've read the excerpt he sent to me, about 42 pages long. I've read it and it has so much interesting information. And I think there's a lot of insights there. You shared something about a politician took notes of the conversation with Glenn Lowry, and there's talks that's possible. There's going to be some, some of the policies adopted from your book, right?
Uh, from your mouth to God. I hope so. So thanks again. The ebook is only $10.
Yeah. So,
Thank
guys,
you.
$10 is something that almost anyone can afford. So, thank you very much, Professor Robert Sherry, for taking out time to talk with us today. We do really appreciate your time, and we like Oliver Tips, we're going to ask whenever we call on you that you oblige us to come talk with us again. So thank you very much for today, and we appreciate it. So guys, like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in another live stream. It's bye for now.
Bye.